today in this passage, do you not, perhaps like I did in reading it, sense a great contrast in Jesus? We have Jesus on the mountaintop, and we have Jesus with the crowd. On the mountaintop, we see the glorified, powerful Messiah. Do you see that? The dazzling white clothes and the glory and the bright light. And then when he comes down the mountain, we see kind of a different sort of Jesus. We see a human, ordinary, bound by the boundaries of humanhood, a teacher and a healer. And I sense in this reading that perhaps we should go back to, I have a great theology professor who comes from the great state of Arkansas, who says that we Yankees have a fundamental misunderstanding with the Bible. You see, we Yankees, we are Congregationalists coming out of Boston, right? The New England heritage that we have, the very optimistic heritage that we have, and yet we miss the word Yah. You see, in English, we use the same word, you, in singular and plural forms. And there is a clue, I think, in this example of Jesus in the crowd that requires that we embrace, as our southern brothers and sisters would, the difference between you and Yah. Because we are talking about a singular and a plural you. You see, when Jesus comes down the mountain, the words that he uses in the original language is Yah. It is plural. When he says perverse and faithless generation. And then in the original language, what he says to the Father, bring your son here, is singular. In those two statements from him, he switches from the plural to the singular, from y'all to you. And here is why I think this is important. Earlier in chapter 9, Jesus taught his disciples how to cast out demons. But they were unable to do that here. Only 27 verses earlier in chapter 9, Jesus sent the 12 out. I quote, Jesus called the 12 together and gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases, and he sent them out. Jesus had just taught and empowered his disciples to cast out demons. He comes down from the mountain, and they are unable to do so. I sense that Jesus is perhaps frustrated or exasperated with his disciples, where he is compassionate with the Father. And I think in this idea of y'all and you, I think we stumble over this because we are Western Americans and we individualize everything and we like to read everything, even in the Bible, as though it pertains directly to us and the people we are opposed to. And so I think that sometimes, perhaps, we read each other into the text. Have you ever read your neighbors into the text? Have you ever read other members in the congregation into the text? Perhaps co-workers or community members into the text? I'm sure in the United Methodist Church this week they are reading each other into the text. I'll confess to you, it is tempting for a pastor to embody Jesus' frustration with his disciples when they aren't getting it and when they're not being transformed by the teaching that he is leading them through. I think also it's tempting for a congregation to embody the disciples' expectations of divine power and selflessness in their pastor, just like the disciples see the limitless power and lack of weariness in Jesus. Our great expectations of one another only serve to divide us, where we should instead be embodying love as patient and kind and not keeping score. We just read 1 Corinthians 13 a couple weeks ago. declared it one of our favorite passages. We're reminded that that is the nature of God, not just how we treat each other, but I do believe that our great expectations of one another divide us, where instead we should be embodying love that is patient and kind and does not keep score. We also had that crimson thread that traced through the sanctuary a couple of weeks ago. Remember that message, and remember how we are to come to Scripture, and we should be searching for that crimson thread, that voice in the cloud, if you will, to overcome our great expectations. I think there is a reason that we sense dissonance in Jesus' embodiment here. Anyone else, as they heard this passage and see Jesus on the mountain and Jesus in the crowd, thinking there's a little bit of a disconnect between these two references to Jesus? They don't seem to be perfectly aligned. Well, I think there's a reason to that dissonance that we sense. Like the disciples, we are probably clinging to our expectations instead of searching for that great crimson thread in the account of these events. If we pause and we think about the gospel good news of love and restoration, and we look at what we're reading in this account here, look for that crimson thread, I think it makes more sense to us. You see, the voice in the cloud says, "This is my son. Listen to him. This is my son. Listen to him." And then the clouds part and reveal the ordinary Jesus standing in front of them. It's not necessarily the glory, but rather the ordinary. Jesus comes as an unexpected king. He baffles the Hebrews in the way that he arrives, in the way that he teaches, in the way that he lives. Jesus is not the Messiah, this King of David, king type of Messiah that they expect. You see, I think the Hebrews also suffered from this expectation sickness. They had great expectations of a king who would ride in on a war horse and drive the Romans out and bring them back to the glory of King David. But the eternal Son does not come in the form that they expect. We will see that on Palm Sunday. Here we see both the divinely glorified and the humanly humble eternal Son. And the voice of God tells us to listen and follow that humble rabbi. So I encourage us today to adjust our expectations. I had a little bit of a chuckle as I often connect with movie quotes and song lyrics, and I see these two messiahs presented before us, and I think, will the real Messiah please stand up? Please stand up. Please stand up. Don't look that one up. You see, just as the disciples struggled as a result of their great expectations, so too we struggle if we have harmful expectations of one another. But if we would remember that God's very nature is love, not just what God tells us to do, but the very nature of God's existence and being is love. If we would remember that, and if we would keep searching for that crimson thread of grace and redemption, then we will be able to walk with one another in peace and in love. In closing, this is my encouragement to all of us. Perhaps our good news, if you will. If we can listen to Jesus' voice of patient love, follow Jesus' path of restorative redemption, and embody Jesus' example of embracing grace, then our congregation will be transformed. Our community will be transformed. And the suffering and searching souls around us in Greenville will be comforted and liberated.